Welcome to the second video on learning how to shoot a hinge release, specifically the knock-on to smooth release. Now, you should have already watched two other videos. One, how to properly set up and adjust your to smooth, but the other one is how to do it part one. You'll find both those on the Knock-on Archery YouTube channel. And in those videos, you're going to be learning several key steps, but more importantly, the very first video was specifically learning on a release trainer. Now in this video, we are now moving on to learning how to shoot that on our bow. So it's going to be the next step to the process. And one thing that's going to be critical is for you to identify what level you're at. Are you a beginner to this whole thing? Are you an intermediate that feels some comfort but want to progress? Or are you someone who is very comfortable with the hinge and have shot it for many years? You feel comfortable pulling it back with your bow. You've already had one. You feel comfortable shooting rounds with one. You're just wanting to try a new and better release. If you're that person and you're at an expert level with extreme comfort, then I would say I totally condone you getting after it with whatever type of target face you want to. If you're an intermediate level where you do feel comfortable drawing back with the release, letting down with the release, and you feel like you do have some understanding of the movement of the release, but you're trying to learn the process of steadying your pin and actually letting that release move and pivot and going through your process, letting your pin float until that shot happens, and you're really just trying to maybe go from a level 5 with the hinge up to about that level 7 or 8, then I would recommend a larger single spot target and start out close at first. Don't be afraid of having something to where the entire bullseye is within the main frame of your sight picture, because having the pin on the target and allowing that float to happen and going through the movements that we talk about today are going to be very, very important to trying to put all this together. If you try to go to a smaller target too fast, then you may end up having a little bit slower overall process than if you really take some of these fundamental steps that I'm going to recommend to begin with up front. Now, if you're a beginner and you followed the first video and you're comfortable with understanding how a release works, you've gone ahead and played with the adjustments of your release to where you can understand, having to use more movement or less movement for it to fire, and you're actually moving on to trying this for the first time with your bow, then I'm going to recommend you simply go with a blank bail. There's nothing wrong with being up close to the target, having no aiming spot on that target, because again, I don't want to overload what you're trying to think about. I want to try to let you simplify the things that you're focusing on, which right now are specifically the release more than the sight pin. The sight pin and learning to steady and improve some of the mid to high level scores are definitely going to be something that have to come later. Learning this process is something that needs progression. It needs to happen over time, and you also need to be able to be totally comfortable just working on execution, timing, and rhythm on a blank bail regardless of what level that you're at. The same is true with the right release trainer, because I feel like some of my best years ever as an archer were years where I did most of my training just with the string because of how much I traveled. And most of my shooting was actually done in competition more so than during practice. My practice was simply working with my release, learning preload, learning movement, and really working on understanding that release enough to where I really knew how long it took to try to get that to fire, and also the amount of effort that I put into that. So make sure you assess yourself, understand which of those targets that are going to be best for you. And lastly, if you're someone who struggles with target panic or buck fever, and you know deep down that you having your pin on the target and trying to hold it in the middle of that target gives you an urge to make that shot happen, then I'm going to recommend you take another step as well. And that is simply, for the very first few weeks with this release, to go ahead and remove your sight off your bow so that you can simply work on the fundamentals of knowing how to draw the bow back without it firing by accident, coming to your anchor, centering through your peep, and then actually understanding and not feeling anxiety maybe when you hear that click for the first time, or feeling like you're able to continually have motion and movement in that release until it fires. And without trying to confuse things with having a sight pin and an aiming spot, or even having to center your peep and your scope and level your bubble, if you eliminate all those little things, you're going to start to really understand the functionality and the movement of a hinge release much, much faster. So this is the first step. Assess where you're at, and from there we're going to go ahead and talk about what you need to do to actually draw and shoot your bow for the first time with a hinge release. Now you should know by now, to properly load your release, you need to make sure that the hook is properly closed and that the head is laid all the way back like this. From there, you're going to go ahead and hook your release on the D-loop, and you're going to want to make sure that you are drawing with your index finger and your thumb wrapped around this post, just like this. You need to understand that if you put any tension on this release with your middle finger or your ring finger, it's going to cause this head to pivot, and it's going to cause the head to fire. So you need to make sure that you're only pulling with your index finger and your thumb as you draw the bow back. Now, one of the most important things about a hinge release is obviously understanding how it functions, and that's why I did the part 1 video on how to properly shoot a hinge release, so that you learn how this functions with a string trainer or a release trainer. And again, I would highly urge you, if you've never drawn a bow back with the hinge release, or if you haven't ever really shot a release that functions like this, to make sure you try it on a training device before your bow. Because if you pull with the wrong fingers as you're drawing back, you are going to cause that head to pivot, which is how it's designed, and it is going to open and allow the string to go forward. And if you're loaded with 70 pounds of pull when that fires, then this fist is going to be a projectile to your face. You don't want that. So what you need to understand is, as you hook this on, you want to make sure that you're really only pulling with the thumb wrapped around the post and your index finger. My middle finger is actually straightened out just like this, so that I'm not trying or accidentally putting pressure of my middle finger on the release as I pull back, or that is what's going to happen. So I have my middle finger next to the release, but my middle finger is actually forward. It's not adding pressure on the inside casing. It's actually just relaxed and straight. Again, the pressure is on my index finger and my thumb. The other thing I want to talk about is the importance of learning to once you draw back, learning to actually straighten your hand flat. This is something that's really, really important because a lot of people, because they're worried about the hinge style, they make a fist and they go a little bit too deep with their finger into the hinge itself. And it's important that you keep that release down this center row of knuckles so that you can keep your hand flat, just like this. So just to give you a look, I might have a little bit of tension as I'm first drawing, but then I'll actually slightly flatten my hand once I come to full draw. So I'll have, again, pressure on my index and my thumb. Middle finger is there, but it's not wrapped around. I'm going to draw back, and from here I'm going to straighten my hand so that I'm able to come in to my anchor position and then find my peep sight. Okay, same thing for letting it down. You want to make sure that the tail end of the release is rolled forward, because anytime that tail end starts to pivot back, then the head is going to be moving and it's going to eventually fire. Now, in the setup video, I talked about being able to have a clicker as an option in that release. Now, whether to have the clicker or not have a clicker is probably more of an expert level decision with your release. I think it's a very good option to have when you first set it up, because what the clicker lets you know is it gives you a small click when you get close to the edge of firing. And how much further that release has to pivot until it actually fires is really going to be determined by how much further you moved the secondary moon past the first moon, which was what gives you that click. So I'll just give you a little idea here of what the click does. A lot of times the click is very good because when you draw back, if you're in the moment of getting into your anchor or settling into your peep and you accidentally put some pressure on the release in the wrong way, you're all of a sudden going to hear that click, and that is an identifier that, oh, I'm already moving this release. I really like it because I draw back, get into my anchor position, get into my peep, and I'll slightly add a little pressure of my middle finger on the release. And once the release starts to move, I'm going to hear my click. I have it set fairly fast in the motion. And then once that happens, I know that I have about that equal amount of movement before the release is actually going to fire. If you're in the process of settling in and anchoring and you hear that click, then you need to understand that you might be moving your hand to a position which is going to cause it to fire. So if I was going through my motion, drawing back, anchoring, getting on the target, there's the click. Once I hear that click, I know that this is very close to firing. I can, however, still keep the tail end forward and let that release down. Okay, but again, you always want the tail end forward. It's actually one of the reasons why I like shooting a hinge release with 2 fingers versus 3, because it actually allows me to take my ring finger and push that tail forward as I let the bow down. So that's one way that I like to do it. But as we draw and I anchor and I look through my peep, I go ahead and level my bow and I'll get my pin on the target. And once that happens, I'm actually going to go through a few little movements in my hand to make it fire. One of the movements is bringing my middle finger to that release and slightly increasing just a little bit of pressure. Once I hear that click, then at that moment I know that I'm actually needing to focus on steadying the bow, letting the pin float, continually having pressure of my rear elbow towards the wall behind me. But then to get it to go through that last bit of motion before it fires, I actually just focus on letting tension off of my thumb and the thumb peg, and then slightly relaxing the index finger so that the release actually pivots around the middle finger, which is firm. Okay, you don't want to let the release actually, when I talk about relaxing the index finger, I'm relaxing the index finger while maintaining the release in this center row of knuckles. I'm not relaxing my hand out like this to where the release is going to get pulled out of our hand. I'm simply transferring movement. So in other words, in a drawback position, you've got tension here on the index, not on the middle. But in order to get it to fire, that weight has to transfer to where you're actually having more weight on the middle finger, less weight on the index finger. That's how I personally like to shoot it. I would recommend to start with that your click and how much movement you have to make in order for it to fire is just a little bit more than what you know that you're going to want to deal with once you're actually shooting at a target. But it's very, very important to start there to get that understanding. So I'm going to go ahead and do this and just give you a quick idea of how this would go. Drawing back, the bow stops, my release hand is directly on the side of my face. I'm coming over to the side of my face, tip of the nose on my string, applying pressure with the middle finger. There's my click. Elbow to the back wall, relax the index finger. And the shot fires. This release right now is set about the same as what I would actually shoot a round with it set at. There's not a lot of movement, but again, it all is a matter of how much you've learned to shoot the release. So once I've shot, I want to make sure that I just simply lift the head enough to where that hook automatically closes. The head's laid back, the hook is locked, which is a great design feature of the Too Smooth. I'll hook it on my loop, and again, pulling pressure is with index and my thumb. So I'm going to raise my bow to the target, draw back. Again, middle finger is next to the release but not around the release. I'm going to anchor, index finger under my jaw, tip of the nose of the string, start to build pressure of the middle finger. There's the click. Now I'm focused on steadying the bow, pulling the elbow, relaxing the index finger until it fires. That is a method that I've talked about for many years called shooting with relaxation, which means I'm relaxing or letting tension off the index finger so that the release naturally pivots in the hand until it shoots. I'd like you now to take a few looks at some close-up shots of what my hand is actually doing during the shot process. Now what I've done is I've taken this release and I've actually adjusted it so that the release will fire a little bit later after the click. Because now that I've shown you how I would shoot it at an expert level, I want to show you a way that I think might be best for you to start. Now again, you're going to see a lot more movement. As an archer, you're going to feel a lot more movement. But this is a great way to understand the release and also start out shooting either on those bigger single spots or on the blank bail. So I'm going to give you a look here at what a little bit more movement is going to mean. And this is also a very good way to set your release if you're someone who actually likes to activate a hinge release by contracting your middle or ring finger. Some people have been taught that way. I personally like the method of not having a lot of movement in my hand and just lightly relaxing that finger while maintaining it, not relaxing the whole hand, just literally relaxing it enough to transfer. Some people like to actually make a fist or curl the back fingers to get it to pivot and fire. Personally, I don't like to have that much movement necessarily, so there are two different ways to do it. I'm a relaxation method person, and the reason I like that is because it does identify moments, especially during competition when I'm tense. If my shots aren't firing and they're not moving and I feel like I've got a lot of pressure, I realize that I'm just fisted up and I'm tight and I'm not actually making fluid, smooth shots. So I actually like to be able to identify, okay, that shot wasn't happening. I can cancel the shot and tell myself, you need to relax. You need to, not be so tense and tight. Stand proud. Come to your anchor position. Make sure you're able to relax and focus on that target and also the rear elbow movement to the wall behind me in order to get this to fire. But let's go ahead and look at what a little bit more movement could be for someone who is shooting this for the first time. So anchored, tip of the nose to the string. I'm centering my peep, moving my middle finger onto the release. There's the click. Now I'm going to relax and pull the elbow and relax and pull the elbow and relax and pull the elbow. You can see a lot more movement, having to be on the target a lot more, but it is a very good way for you to learn to just trust the movement of the release and also focus on what you're doing with the release more so than focus on what you're doing with your pin on the target. I feel like a lot of times target panic and target anticipation develop because people are so focused on aim versus motion and movement. And that's one of the reasons why I like a hinge release, is because for some people it actually draws your attention away from that aim and brings the conscious mind to focus on what you're doing with the release. So there's different styles of target panic, there's different types of anticipation. The reality is all of these different types of releases that are on the market, whether it's a wrist strap, a thumb activated, a tension activated like the Silverback, or now the hinge style release, all of them can give you the same shot and the same accuracy if you shoot them all correctly. However, they just all have a different way to get there, which is important because not everyone has the same problems when it comes to target anticipation, shot anticipation, or buck fever. All right, here we go. So now what I'm going to do, because I'm actually knowing that this release has just a little bit more movement, I'm actually going to put a little bit more tension around the ring finger once I get to that click, so that I'm actually getting that release to pivot a little bit more by the contraction of my middle finger versus having to let the index finger go so much. And this is one of the key principles to learning a hinge release properly, is learning how to be aggressive in the movement and speed up the pivoting of the release in order to get it to fire. When you're at an expert level, you're going to be able to have that release set a little bit faster, a little hotter, so that you're able to actually slow your movement down with minimal movement, but get the shot to fire at the same time. I think if you're at this beginner or intermediate level, learning how to actually trust you moving that release, focus on that, I think can be a big positive. Draw back, even with the anchor position, I'm on the side of the face, the bow stopped, coming over to my anchor, standing tall, standing proud, tip of the nose to the string, moving to the click. Now I'm going to start my shot. And again, this is, for me, a lot of movement. So it's a good way to learn, but you also, as you work on this, you're going to understand that you have more and more comfort with the release, and you're going to be able to not have as much travel between the click and the actual shot. And you'll also learn to actually change the speed of your hand movement to where you can get it to go a little bit faster, even though that movement is the same. So now I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing, and I'm going to try to adjust my movement a little bit so that the actual timing of this shot is just a little bit faster. You can see big difference between that shot and the first two. And that's what I want you to find, is I want you to get to the point where you're able to draw comfortable, get to that click, and just really focus and commit to getting that shot to go. I'm going to do this one more time, and I'm going to speed it up just a little bit more for you. Now, I'm very adamant about the release trainer. The right release is one that we have on the website, and what I really like about this is that you can take it anywhere. And I know in part one I talked about this, but I want to go back to it now that you've actually seen me use it on the bow. And once you understand that, I want you to now go back to your right release and focus on a few things. So like we just talked about, it's great to understand, coming to your anchor point, being able to apply pressure to the click, and then learning how fast you can move that release until it fired. Now that movement right there is with this release set exactly the same as what I just shot with my bow. And by learning to use this release trainer and feel my anchor, put the tip of that release trainer on the target, getting to your click, and committing to coming through your shot, elbows driving back as you're moving that hand. And again, what I really like is learning to slightly let tension off the index finger as I'm pulling hard with the middle finger. So you're going to be able to just go from your bow right to your release trainer again, focus on the target, come to your click, commit through your shot, and you can see that speed just really starts to get quicker and quicker. So what I want you to do is, anytime you adjust the release, or anytime you're not feeling comfortable with the bow, just grab that release trainer out and go ahead and get a little bit more familiar either with the release setting or just the comfort of going through your stroke. This is a great way to actually start the day, to just warm up the muscles and actually make sure that you're not making any mistakes during the drawing process, feeling your anchor position, making sure your hand's not fisted up, getting used to having your hand flat, getting to that position, getting to your click, and moving through that release. This is a great way to start, and even when you're shooting with your bow, don't be afraid to go back and forth. Once you understand that, the next thing that you can focus on is what you're going to be looking at when it comes to having your pin on the target and just how much movement you should be comfortable with. Now, when it comes to sight movement or your sight picture, a lot of people want to know how much movement is acceptable, and a lot of people want to know how much movement I have. So this is going to be my illustrator, and I've got something that is going to be able to completely cover that white dot. So when it comes to movement, my pin typically moves left and right and slightly up and down, just enough to where I can start to see the opposing color on either side. And I really feel like it's your brain's natural tendency to want to confirm that what you're blocking is actually still there. So I've just really got to the point where I've accepted how much movement I have, and I accept some of that movement. Some days I'm more solid, some days I'm not. That's just part of it. So what I want you to do in relation to the hinge release is I actually want you to get to the point where you draw back, you come to your anchor position. A lot of times my pin is just slightly under the target, but it is close by. I'll anchor and I'll adjust my head so I'm looking through my peep. I'll go ahead and move my pin to cover the spot, and then I'll work on leveling my bow quickly. Once that happens and I'm in that vicinity, I'm going to move the release or add pressure on the middle finger just enough to hear the click. And once the click happens, I'm going to focus on pulling and trying to maintain or steady that movement as I'm continually pulling. If I happen to go off, I don't let all my pressure off the trigger itself, because sporadic movements can happen, and learning to shoot in the wind with the hinge release is also something that's equally important, because there's going to be times where you're trying your best to hold on and you get blown off or you get blown around, and you really have to just start to, if you get blown completely off, then obviously you're not going to keep that movement necessarily going. But if you're in that vicinity, you need to just work on pulling through that release and trusting that sight movement and that pin movement, and just committing to coming through that shot. Remember, some of the best release shooters and compound shooters in the world are shooting hinge style releases in outdoor windy conditions. They've just learned to draw back, get to that click, steady everything up, settle the pin as best they can, allow some of that movement to happen, and then continue their movement until the shot fires. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about is the importance of actually learning how much movement you should have in your release until that starts to move too much, or you're actually holding on the target too long or trying to pull too long to make it happen. That speed is going to be determined by your preload and your commitment and speed into the shot. Just like what I showed you in the last clip where I had the same release, I drew back. Some of the first shots were taking a long time. Then I just got to the point where I was getting to the click, committing to that movement, and I was able to make that shot happen in an adequate time. So the speed of your release and the movement of your front pin are directly related, but you also really need to do some factoring of how much are you actually committing to that shot. If you feel like you're trying to just hold more than actually move through your shot, then you're going to just end up being what I call an aimer, and not someone who's actually committing to just trusting their float, knowing that they do have the float, and pulling through that shot continually. Now, once you've become comfortable with the movement of your release and trusting that float, it's at that point that you're going to be able to actually take that release and maybe start to minimize the amount of movement that that release has after that click. And at that point, you're actually going to be able to almost get your release set to what I showed you at the beginning of the video, where I had a click with barely any movement and the release was firing. And then the last step, probably the most Jedi move of all, is having no click and being able to shoot that hinge release to where you're able to pull through the shot a little bit, relax the finger a little bit, and it's able to fire, which is the way that I've shot it through most of my live feeds where you've seen my live practice rounds. Now you have several more things to work on with your Too Smooth and your hinge style releases. Again, this is a multi-part video series, so be sure to check out the first part and make sure that you focus on that first, then move into learning to shoot it with your bow. And as you work through all of these different steps that we've talked about and you start to get comfortable with that shot, again, you're probably going to be able to start adjusting your release so that it maybe has a little bit more speed, and you're also going to be able to eventually start shooting without a clicker if you so choose, or having a lot shorter adjustment when that clicker happens. So I wish you the best. Until the next video, keep putting them in the middle.